Hello. Warhammer 40,000 has taken many forms over the years, but perhaps some of its most important evolutions came as it formalized its worlds with 2nd edition and became more accessible and successful with its 3rd. Those were collaborative efforts from the design studio, but there is one man who could be said to have been essential in establishing wargaming in the 41st millennium. And that's not even to mention his work on the Skaven, Necromunda, Battlefleet Gothic, a host of other GW projects, and latterly on Judge Dredd and 2000 AD games as well. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with the Overfiend himself, Andy Chambers. Thank you for joining me to have a bit of a chat about some of your experience working at Games Workshop. I wondered if you might be able to start by talking a little bit about how you came to be working at Games Workshop in the first place.
Yes, it's a proper orphan's tale. Not that I am an orphan, might hasten to add. I have a lovely family. Um, I live in Nottingham. Lived in Nottingham all my life. Back when I was a wee nipper, I used to go to a place called Asgard Miniatures up in the Nice Market in Nottingham, which I'd found through the August pages of Military Modelling magazine back in the day. Because my dad used to be a modeler when he was younger. He used to build like scale aircraft models, like 1/12 scale. So, as a very young nipper, my bedroom had a Hurricane and a Sopwith Camel hanging from the ceiling. So I always kind of had an interest in models.
Mm.
And he got me a subscription to Military Modelling magazine, and kind of tucked away in the back of that, because it was very historical based. It was Napoleonics and stuff like that, and specifically about doing scale models of them, not about wargaming. But occasionally they'd have something in about wargaming.
Mm.
And at the back of it, there started to creep in some adverts for things like Dungeons and Dragons and rages of like Greek myth miniatures and stuff like that. And occasionally the odd bit of sci-fi, some spaceships or something like that. So I assiduously tried to track these down, and I had no means really to go to most of these places, but there was one in Nottingham, which was Asgard Miniatures. So I went there and basically spent my early teens annoying them a lot by being around there every moment I could, because I loved it. It was fascinating to me. And through that, um, they had an Asgard War Games club, and guys there went to work at Citadel Miniatures because it was starting to grow then. This is like mid 80s we're talking about. Um, and Citadel Miniatures had a factory actually out in Eastwood, just outside Nottingham. And a few people there got work there. Jez Goodwin actually worked at Asgard Miniatures at the time that
Mm.
I was going. I got to know him first there, and he eventually got a job with Citadel as well, just because they threw so much money at him he couldn't turn it down.
Right.
They were a bit much bigger operation than, because there were a lot of like little garage places around the country doing things, but Citadel represented something that had a factory and was a far more serious operation overall. So they were growing at the time. Um, anyway, through those sort of contacts, one of them ended up running mail order over at Chewton Street in Eastwood for the factory. So he would tap up as younglings as like seasonal labour to come when they had the Christmas rush on, and
Mm.
my it was a rush, I can tell you. So I'd work there for a couple of like 3-month periods over Christmases into New Year type thing. Second time around, I quit because they introduced like, we've got so much backlog, we need you to come in and work on Saturdays, and I was just like, no, I'm not doing that. Um, anyway, some of the people I knew from that and from Asgard ended up working at the studio. Specifically, a guy called Tim Pollard, if you've run across him before now,
Sure.
who's around for the very early days, and Jez ended up there as well, of course. And apropos nothing, in between time, I got into Rogue Trader when it came out, Warhammer 40,000. But what really lit me up was Adeptus Titanicus when that came out, because it came out as a big box game. And it had everything you needed in the box. There were dice, there were rulers, there were the miniatures themselves, there's terrain, the rules, templates, everything was in there.
Mhm.
And that was really novel at that point in time. Generally, if you wanted to get into a game, you bought a rule book or a book even, and then you sourced miniatures from some places and tried to put some armies together and things like that. So it was a very sort of graduated process, particularly if you were young, like I was at the time with no money.
Hmm.
Um, so that was a kind of revelation. I got really into Adeptus Titanicus, played a lot of it, and I was going into Games Workshop to see new stuff, and like Beyblade tanks had come out, stuff like that. Ooh, exciting. I think Codex Titanicus had just about hit at that time as well. And then there appeared on the racks these one-man titans, as they were advertised on the blister, which were
Right.
cool, little Jez early knights, as we call them now. Didn't even know the term for it. I was like, oh, cool, and I got some of those. And generally, White Dwarf was pretty good about having some rules or stats in for stuff when it came out. But there was, notably nothing for these things. And I was like, huh, what's going on? And I asked Tim, I said, what's going on? And he said, well, Jervis Johnson's on sabbatical for 6 months, so nothing's getting done for Adeptus Titanicus right now. This did not sit well with young Andy. I was like, oh, screw that. And as I'd been growing up, I'd written like sets of rules for myself and kind of like cut up other sets of rules and stuck them together into something more like what I wanted. So I was kind of au fait with mucking around with game systems already, and I knew Adeptus Titanicus really, really well. Had absolute confidence that I knew the game. So I was just like, well, screw it, I'll write some. So I actually wrote an article, a White Dwarf article, did the whole thing end to end, bits of color text in it as well, little quotes like they did in White Dwarf. I was quite careful to follow their format. Borrowed my friend's word processor, as it was at the time, because we didn't have PCs, typed it all up, and submitted it to the studio, just sent it in and said, I wrote this article for White Dwarf since you haven't got anything on One Man Titans. Which again, which seems weird that something like that could have landed
Hmm.
now. But back then it was a more kind of open world because all you had was the letters page really in something like White Dwarf magazine. That was their only real contact with the outside world, so people would send stuff in. And that kind of data, I talked earlier about 2000 AD and being subscribed to that since I was a nipper. And that sort of thing as well, where people would write in and sort of say, oh, I thought this article was great. So that kind of feedback mechanism sort of existed, but it was quite rare that people used it.
Right.
So anyway, I sent the article in. They gestated on it for a little while, and eventually I got the word to come in. And I'd come in for like 2 weeks to finish the article off to put in White Dwarf magazine. Yay! And even get
Right.
some money for it. Marvelous. I was unemployed, of course, at the time. So I showed up, and the first thing I knew was that, well, this isn't going to turn into a job because Jervis Johnson was already back from sabbatical by that point. I was actually
Right.
sharing an office with him. So it's like, oh, hi, Jervis. Though it was kind of great to meet him because, he wrote the game that I really liked. So we could talk very much on one level about that.
Did he have thoughts on your one man night rules?
That was the other thing. Was my first introduction to the wonderful world of publishing is like, we didn't use my article at all.
Right. Okay.
It was never even really discussed because, unbeknownst to me, Brian Ansell had got a bee in his bonnet about Scottish clans at the time. He'd read a book called The Steel Bonnets, I think it is, which is all about the Scottish clans and the kind of like raiding across the borders with the English and fighting each other and all this sort of thing. So he was really into that idea, and he wanted this. He had this idea that they could do knights, the one-man titans, call them knights, do them as like knight houses on different worlds and things like that. And that had been developed up by Jervis, and I think Bill King had a hand in that as well.
Right.
So there was kind of like extant background for it, which needed to be, followed through. And it was in early White Dwarf articles with all the banners and stuff like that, if you recall that. That would come much later, though. In the intervening time, there was like a ton of other White Dwarf articles that needed doing for Adeptus Titanicus, like now. Actually, they needed doing like 3 months ago, which included things like a load of orc vehicles, variant Baneblade types. That's when the Shadow Sword came out, I think, actually. I think Baneblade and Shadow Sword were already out. What it was a load of other variants on that chassis, so storm hammers and all that kind of stuff. So poured out onto my desk, sort these out, and then an article about what actually turned into the card system that got used later for second edition Space Marine, but it was basically like taking subunits and putting together a company structure for it. And I did an
Mm.
article on that for Space Marines and things like that. 2 weeks came and went very quickly indeed, and there was still a ton of work to do. And I mean, I ended up at workshop for 14 years without pause from there on in. And those early days, the studio was not part of the factory. It was actually in the middle of Nottingham. It was Enfield Chambers. It was in just out from Weekday Cross in Nottingham. Nottinghamite, you know where the hell I'm talking about. Right in the middle of town, suffice to say. Like kind of
Right.
squeezed into these little narrow offices across 3 floors in a building that was, I don't know, kind of Gorman Gast-like in its own way.
Because that was a time when Brian Ansell wanted that real distinction, right? He wanted the design studio to be separate to the
I
miniatures.
don't know how much of it. Probably, yeah. I can
Yeah.
only assume it was by design that he had them completely separated from each other. Because yeah, having worked at the factory and worked at the studio, they were very different places.
Right.
Very different places. You know, the factory was a factory, full of like casters from Eastwood who would like run up to the pub to get 2 pints down their neck at lunchtime, every lunchtime, and so on.
Right. And then came back
Uh,
to work with hot metal.
oh yeah, and then came back to
Right.
Spincast Lead for the afternoon as well.
Right.
Not that I wish to imply that it was a dangerous environment or anything
Oh,
like that. Nothing like that. No, no, no. No, no, no. That was perfectly normal for the late 80s anyway.
right.
Driving their own cars home on 2 pints as well.
Well, it was a different time, I guess.
Mm.
We might summarize it.
It was a very different time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you've worked on Adeptus Titanicus and Space Marine, which were the sort of exciting games that you were playing yourself, right? So where did you sort of go from there? How did you end up working on all the other systems at GW over the years?
um well, I got pulled in for doing all kinds of different work because I was young and fairly malleable and keen to do like anything to be useful, really. So I got pulled in for doing White Dwarf articles. I got pulled in for helping out do the paste up for the Second Realm of Chaos book. Did
Right.
some of that for a little while. I got put on to doing photography for White Dwarf. That was a fairly major job of mine early on. And all the time through this, I was taking the opportunity to, I don't know, not even consciously taking the opportunity, but being a pain in the ass to Jervis, to Bill, and to Richard Halliwell, who was also next door, because I spent a fair amount of that time playtesting game systems with him that he was working on to try and get a follow up for Space Hulk.
Hmm.
Um, so busy, busy, busy. And then there was like a Mighty Empires campaign that was a big part of our lives back then, and playing a lot of fantasy and stuff like that, and just kind of playtesting with people. So I assume I got a reputation of knowing all the games, or at least the ones I played a lot, because I was young and had a very sponge-like mind, and I was really keen. So I started it. I started getting jobs as well as doing continuous stuff for White Dwarf. Of here's Warhammer Battle Magic. Nigel Stillman started on it, but he can't finish it. He's got to do something else, and we need it done. So finish off these 200 odd cards, and write the rule book for it. It's like, all right, off we go. There's material for all of this, so invent some of it, and you can thank that for various things that you get in early Warhammer that were in Warhammer Battle Magic, my first job, and the High Elf book as well when that came out for Warhammer, because it was a new edition of Warhammer. They'd gone to that everything in a box
Hmm.
approach to it. It was High Elves and Goblins, I think, for that edition. I don't know
Yeah.
which edition it was. I never really
That'd be
followed
fourth
them.
edition. Yeah.
Okay, fourth edition.
Yeah.
So I did the High Elf book for that, and a little while later they asked me to do the Skaven book, mainly because I'd collected Skaven before I joined the studio at Games Workshop previously to do role playing with, play D&D with my friends. We used them as monsters because they were cool. They were, again, Jez Goodwin miniatures. Jez made the bestest orcs ever and the bestest dwarves ever. Well, he was at Asgard, and then he got into Citadel and made the bestest Skaven ever because there was nothing quite like them. So, of course, we collected some of them and painted them. So I already had like a little starting force. And I took the opportunity to beg, borrow, steal as many other Skaven from around the studio as I could. Because, place like that, you'll find just like unpainted metal in a box somewhere shoved into somebody's desk that they were given as a sample and forgot about. And a big stack of sprues where they've basically clipped off, because if you remember at the time there was a one of the few injection molded plastic frames that have been done as an experiment by Brian Ansell quite early on, was to do a fantasy set. So it had like an elf, a dwarf, a skaven, a goblin on it. I can't
Mm.
remember, maybe an orc as well. Anyway, there was loads of those frames where they'd taken like one or two or three of those out there and not taken the skaven. So hoover all those up, and I got basically rounded up enough for, and plus you got a nice discount as well for buying things. So I rounded up enough to make an entire Skaven army for Warhammer. This was 3rd edition as
Mm.
well, Warhammer Armies period. So the units were huge, and I painted the entire thing up over the course of like a month and a half over the winter time. Learned not to do blocks of 40 miniatures at a time. It's too many, but nonetheless did it, and then brought it in. And because it was, it was a cohesive, collected army that one person had put together, not one of the heavy metal crew, like painting a unit here and a unit there, or a miniature here and a miniature there. It was a bit of a rarity at the time.
Mm.
So it made its way into White Dwarf, of course, as an
Mm.
article. I wrote about how I'd painted it up and the thinking behind putting it together. And, it was a whole article. That was quite seminal, I think, for a lot of army collectors. I hear about it to this day, of like, "Ooh, I did a Skaven army like yours back in, and this is like 1991, probably two, something like that. Fuck knows, early,
For sure.
because I'd started in March 1990, and I think it was like the winter of 90 to 91 that I did it specifically for the Mighty Empires campaign, because I was playing Skaven at the time.
Right.
So yeah, so I had an entire Skaven army. So yes, that's how I ended up working on other things other than just White Dwarf. Was the High Elf book was a many-legged thing where I worked with Jazz and I worked with Bill King, because they did the background and the color text for it, and I just handled the army list, the worky bits in terms of game. Um, the Skaven book, I wrote the whole thing end to end. I got some advice off Bill King about how to write color text and stuff like
Mm.
that. Really educational. But I wrote most of it myself. Actually, no, he wrote a little bit of color text for it as well. He wrote like a little spread at the back.
Right.
So I think over the point of that, by this point, Rick Priest is going like, huh, this kid can really do things, can't he? Just like cut him loose on something and off he goes. So the next big things that came up was he'd just done Space Marine 2nd edition, which had taken all that Adeptus Titanicus 1st edition Space Marine stuff and kind of knocked it into more of a game rather than a game that then had a load of stuff added onto the outside of it, so it was a
Mm.
bit creaky. And done some good stuff with it, I say, put in the card system for building your forces and everything like that. And he'd done Space Marine 2nd edition. He did Armies of the Imperium, which was the first big supplement for it, covered Imperial Guard and Space Marines. But there was a bunch of other stuff to be done. And he was like, Andy, come here. So I got Orc and Squat Warlords, I got Chaos Renegades, I got Tyranid Hive War, and did all of them. Yeah, so just solo, just plowed through them
Mm.
basically, because it was great fun. I loved it. Just a bunch of wacky units to make up rules for, basically, in different game systems. And my apologies for anybody who played 2nd edition and found it to be unbalanced at times. All I can say is it was very early in my career. I just did things. And work with Jervis, obviously, on trying to get balance right, and particularly things like costs and stuff like that. And we tested stuff. So by the time I'd done all 3 of those supplement boxes, I was getting to be kind of a bit of an old hand at this publishing lark. And I say
Mm.
this is early 90s, so it's all golf ball printers and green screens, literally, and using ASCII codes if you wanted to use italics and shit like that. And I'd managed to get my head around that side of things. And the big thing that hit after that was 2nd edition 40k, which, I mean, 40k had been rattling around since Rogue Trader Days 1988 at that point, and it had had a ton of supplemental material on it through White Dwarf. I mean, some of it I did myself, but a lot from other places too, from other people, I should say, in White Dwarf. Plus several books of like extra rules and stuff some of which was like dragging together what had been in White Dwarf into like compendiums and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Point being, 40k had reached the point where if you wanted to play 40k with all of the rules, you needed like stack of books, and it was hurting young backs and things like that to try and drag that around. Plus, bear in mind your metal army as well. You had to be a bit of a pack mule by that point to actually play. So the decision was made that it would be a good time, much as had been done with Warhammer, to do a boxed 40k rules, miniatures, terrain, whole 9 yards. And Rick tasked me with he did the kind of like the he kept the core background to make sure that the Imperium didn't get too wacky from
Hmm.
going from Rogue Trader dudes. So he did the background and the background text, Bill King did color text for that. Everything else was me overall. Righty right, lots of rules, lots of reading what had been put into White Dwarf and trying to drag it into some sort of coherent fashion, and doing like a set of army lists for everybody as well. Because what we'd heard back through those narrow, thin channels that came from retail and just through getting letters. Hello, I run a gaming club in Alaska. Have some questions about Rogue Trader. That sort of stuff from snail mail. What we heard was that generally people, well, Rogue Trader had been kind of set up as a fairly kind of semi role play sort of a game. Yeah, you could have battles in it, but that wasn't intrinsic. And what they'd found is people actually wanted to have battles. They wanted
Hmm.
army lists. They wanted to go bashy with it, not do a little curated game master sort of role play experience so much. I mean, some people like that, but it's a lot of ask overall. It's a lot easier for people to line up their collections and go at it. So a lot of the brief was to make second edition a more suitable environment for doing that with. So put a lot of energy into things like scenarios, and we did mission cards to give people, here's why you're fighting, because just lining up and fighting is just dull.
Hmm.
It's all right the first time, but it's tedious, and it also tends to overemphasize certain kinds of armies. There's no point in being mobile if there's nothing to be mobile for,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So it was a good idea to introduce some different. And if all of this seems blindingly obvious now in 2023, believe me, it wasn't back then. It was something of like, we can give people reasons for fighting it, that kind of level. So we introduced that and war gear cards, and Rick came up with the data fax system for how to handle the vehicles, which was zany but interesting at
Hmm.
least. Whereas the previous one in Rogue Trader was kind of like a bit, didn't really do it basically. So armed with all this, put it all together. Second edition 40k. As a joke, almost they printed 40,000 copies of it when we first put it together. That sold out almost immediately because it actually proved to be a roaring success.
Hmm.
And then that rolled into doing codexes, which again, same sort of pattern as with Space Marine, where Rick could do the first one or two of them to set a format and a kind of
Hmm.
pace for it. And then me and Jervis took over and handled the rest overall.
I mean, you worked on quite a few different codexes over the years, right? So
Oh yeah. Well,
it's very,
basically, whenever you were working on a codex, there'd be somebody who was like the lead, in effect. It was their baby, but we'd always tend to tap each other,
hmm.
even if it was just for advice or for directly. Can you come up with some special characters for me or something like that, just to spread the load out a little bit, and also just because it was fun.
Were there any choices around? Because like that second edition also seemed like an opportunity to. It seems like you were sort of cleaning up the model range as well, right? Certain things were left out, so the squats being a sort of example started to get
Over the
faded
course of
out.
it, I mean, no, I mean the second edition, the squats were still in at the
Right.
start of it. We included them. They've got stats in the Codex Imperialis for second edition, and they were in the Black Codex, which is what the combined army list thing was. But they just never got anything done with them over the
Right.
course of second edition, is what it was. When it came around to doing a codex for them, everyone was like, "Yeah, let's do something else first."
Right. Okay.
Which various different people have said, "Oh, it's because they didn't sell well, or we couldn't think of anything clever to do with them," and all that sort of stuff. Apologies to squad players. I was quite fond of them myself because I'd done orc and squat warlords. So, I had skin in the game as far as I was concerned, and I kind of found them on a macro level like that in
Mm.
epic scale quite individual and cool. To me and to Jervis, actually, the biggest problem, I shouldn't speak for him. To me, the biggest problem was that when you treated them in 40k, they were kind of just like a bit of a blend between Imperial Guard and Space Marines, in effect, which was something we were very consciously trying to avoid at the time.
Mm.
And a lot of the eliminations that you're talking about in terms of Rogue Trader through to second edition was trying to put some clear water in between Space Marines and Imperial Guard.
Right.
Because before that, they shared everything. They shared rhinos, they shared land speeders, everything, basically, jump packs, all the rest of it. And we did make a conscious choice. Rick made a conscious choice when doing the Imperial Guard Codex and the Space Marine Codexes for them, that we wanted the Space Marines to operate differently to Imperial Guard, and Imperial Guard to be very much that kind of far more almost Napoleonic or World War One or World War Two style massed ranks, tanks, artillery, not jump packs particularly, not land speeders and stuff like that. Fancy tech like that went to the Space Marines was the idea, not jet
Right.
bikes. In fact, nobody got jet bikes in the end out of those two because they went to the Eldar instead to make them more distinct.
Right.
And there was kind of like that sort of separating out process started to happen in second edition in a conscious fashion. Yeah, because it's like people would always ask for Eldar Terminators. And it's like, well, no, you won't get Terminators because Space Marines have Terminators. You'll get something different, which, of course, eventually turned into Wraithguard as their Terminator equivalent, but not the same thing.
Mm.
So we were trying to, because it's very, and Rogue Trader even, was a bit rife with this sort of stuff, like Orcs being another classic example. What do Orcs use? Bolt guns. Oh, okay. And plasma guns. Uh-huh. Anything of their own? And there were a few things that of their own that have been done through the Walk the Orcs books, 3 books worth of it. They had a few of their own distinctive weapons, but for the most part, they just plugged into that sort of generic war gear range, which was also used by the Imperial Guard, or Imperial Army, as it was then, also used by the Space Marines, also used by everyone, basically. Tyranids as well, for that matter. So there was a conscious sort of like, well, we're not going to do that. We'll different strokes, different folks, and certainly there can be some commonality between, Alaskan is Alaskan. It doesn't matter if it's an Eldar one or whatever. But there was a starting to grow that idea that the different factions should be different to one another on that level, on a design level, on a rules level, as well as aesthetics.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems successful, right? Because the sort of formalized version of those different forces very much became the foundation of where we are now, right? There's not been
Yeah,
much
I think it
change
was an
for a lot
essential
of
part
them.
of the process. It was a little painful. It is a little painful to this day. I know for some people that they
Mm.
lost things as they
Sure.
see it. They were taken away from us. They got squatted or what have
Of
you.
course, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the design process, I'm afraid, my friend. What Trader was it was a marvelous sort of like you can do all these different things. It had a lot of flexibility, and that was intrinsic and implicit to it. We took a lot of that away
Mm.
over time to sharpen up the images, to make it easier for people to collect particular armies and make them thematic and stuff like that. Because it's a bit like the DM argument as well. Of like, if you're imaginative, if you like writing your own backgrounds, if you like working out army lists and working with numbers, great, absolutely great. That Rogue Trader was perfect for you. A lot of people aren't entirely comfortable with that. They don't have the confidence, or they don't have the math. They don't feel they have the math skills and all the rest of it. A lot of it's about confidence, actually. Let's be honest. So for them, a bit more guidance, a bit more direction, some slightly sort of like reduced choices is a good thing. It's not a terrible thing. It actually smooths out the process a lot for them. And you know what? The way I always try to view it and try to do in third is you can always circle back later and say, well, these guys are Imperial Guard regiments entirely made up of Rough Riders, or Orc clans that have got nothing but light vehicles in them, or stuff that you could do in the past but we took away. You can give it back,
Mm.
but you've got to establish a baseline before you start saying, it's zany, you can do anything. That was the general thinking behind it, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that the simplification and that increased accessibility of the game, as well as putting it into one box, so you had everything to start with, do you think that is what all sort of contributed to 40K being such a massive success and almost sort of beginning the journey of overtaking Warhammer, which to that point had been, sort of
That
sitting there?
started in second, if I'm honest. The rot was already starting by the time second edition Warhammer 40,000 had come around. It's just people found it easier to
Mm,
collect 40k armies, and I don't know. It was a bit, again, time at the time, the 90s. Sci-fi was a bit more in,
mm,
and yeah, absolutely. One of the things, having come from that very early, kind of like I gamed in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that, it was very inaccessible to a youngster like me. And I remembered this, and I remember the rule systems I'd had to try and play, and the fact that I'd never really got them and things like that. And, always felt like I needed help. And gamers weren't necessarily very helpful back then,
mm,
particularly to young kids and stuff like that. So it was kind of kicking back against that to a large extent. Like, no, make it direct, make it more simple. Rick was really, really good on things like this. Jervis even better, because they realized that a lot of the smokescreen that you'd got in those 70s and 80s rules were about trying to make it realistic. And yeah, that's always a laudable goal in many ways, but it can't be your alpha and your omega. What you need something first and foremost to be is playable. You need people to be able to learn the game, play it, enjoy it, and come back for more. And that was something that overwhelmingly those early games failed to do. They were very easy to bounce off.
mm.
Uh, Great if you could get into them, because they were usually very complex and very granular, but hard to get into as a rule of thumb. And we wanted things that were easier to get into. Jervis was the most interesting. He was a real crusader on this front, because he went through exactly this cycle with Blood Bowl very, very early on, from quite a complex, granular first edition of it, where you could play for hours and never score and things like that, through to about the time that we'd started working on, was it before or just after? Around the time we were doing second edition, 40k, he was working on Blood Bowl. I think it was fourth edition by that point. The one with the block dice in it, anyway, because we got into funny dice at the time. And that was genius and so far ahead of its time, really, in how it rendered down the gaming experience to every game is an abstraction, right? You have to accept that at the outset. What matters on that realism front is like what you emphasize, what you make the players do with their time, what you make them think about in terms of the game. And that will give it far more realism in a way, despite the abstraction,
Mm.
than endless lists of modifiers and tables and charts and all the rest of it. And what Blood Bowl did brilliantly, still does brilliantly to this day, which is why it's still around, is it puts you in the seat of being, coach of a football team. And sports ball, man. I mean, just even making that kind of a game was astounding to me. I was like, wow, I loved Blood Bowl so much. Played far too much of it with my GT Skaven team, and won all the cups in the studio tour. And the other thing about it that we learned in the course of him doing that was campaigns, and how much they draw people in, and how much people love to get invested in that way in their team or what have you.
Mm.
So yeah, there was a lot of thinky think going on in the background. It wasn't just arbitrary. Oh, we're going to take things away because we're bastards. But at the same time, I know it was upsetting for people, and I'm sorry for that. We probably could have been better about it in retrospect. But the
Well,
fact that people still go to me now, I've still got my squat army in metal, you bastard. It's like,
I mean, a
you're
good
such a
example of
private
it, I think,
edition.
is the well, of course, the squats now being back, or at least a form of squat
Yes,
has
they
returned.
finally made their return.
Yeah,
And it was something, I used to spend a lot of time with Jez Goodwin talking about what we might do in the future. And over the years since I left Games Workshop, it's been fun to see them come out
Hmm.
of, G Still Cults, Adeptus Mechanicus.
Right.
And finally, what we were thinking about, in effect, it's not exactly what we were thinking about, but very, very close, for
Right.
squats as well, the League of Votan that we've been doing recently. They do
There's
look very
other.
nice. They're a
They
bit too
do.
Space Marine-y to
They
me,
are
to be
quite. I mean, you
honest.
talked about creating that distance between Space Marines and Imperial Guard. They've definitely
Yeah.
skewed way further to the Space Marine side, I think now.
Yeah, 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 and this is part of the problem. They end up going one way or the other. Is really what it comes down to. So
Mm.
I don't blame them for that. I think visually they could have perhaps tried a little harder. But at the end of the day, Space Marines represent the most popular faction in the most popular game for Games Workshop. And as a business, disappointing as it is for us collectors, that means they're always going to push more Space Marines on you
Sure.
because what works works. And that's been kind of like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy forever now
Yeah.
because Space Marines were really, really popular even back in Rogue Trader days. Nothing to do with the fact they had a 30-piece, plastic kit available, had 2 vehicles at a time when nobody else had anything except metal. Nothing to do with that. No. No, no, no. But nonetheless, that set up the conditions, to a large extent for their ongoing success, and, success breeds success.
Yeah, certainly does. Yeah, yeah, and like you say, that self-fulfilling element of if that's what you invest in, then that's what's
Little bit,
yeah.
yeah. And to be fair, when it came out, RTBO1 back in the day was a fantastic bit of gear. I mean, I explained to you the difficulties of actually trying to collect forces in a cohesive fashion. So one that you could like stick together
Mm,
and pose and stuff like that was a great revelation. Really, really terrific. And cleverly done because, guys in full armor are quite easy to make models out of in that way. You know, can't really do that with fantasy models very successfully and stuff like that. You can, but particularly with the technology back then, they wouldn't have looked good.
mm,
But guys in armor, they look hot and plastic easy to convert as well. So that's part of what set them up as well, is that they were actually an ideal medium for it. And honestly, Space Marines are very easy to collect, or still are. They need relatively few forces. They're easier to paint. They hit hard. They do well on the battlefield, etc., etc. So
yeah,
yeah, it's. I'm
yeah,
no big fan of Space Marines. You may or not may not be able to tell from my 14 years of being there, but all I could do is try and keep a lid on them basically
sure.
while I was there and make sure some attention got paid to the other races. Hey, we even managed to introduce some new ones as well,
Yeah,
which
of
I always take
course.
as being a great victory.
Yeah, yeah, something that's not really happened as often as one might expect over the
Well, yeah,
subsequent
I
years.
say although we've just been talking about them actually introducing entirely new factions as well, but yeah, they've been fewer and further between because from being on the inside, it's an uphill battle.
Sure.
But why aren't we just making more Space Marines? We know they'll sell. And in fairness, as a business, then that's just it. There's risk. There's risk whenever you do something new.
Of course, yeah, and it's and not to take away from the Space Marines, they are iconic, literally iconic. They're very well
Oh yes,
designed, of course, as well.
yes.
But you mentioned just when you were talking about the sort of Blood Bowl and the way that some of that works and the campaigns
Mm,
and things like that.
mm.
I'm just wondering if how much did the development of Blood Bowl sort of influence what you would go on to do in the making of Necromunda, say?
Oh,
Because that's
massively, directly,
right,
absolutely directly. Yeah, because what we got out of Blood Bowl in particular was that kind of tribal knowledge about campaign systems. So when it came up as like basically Tom Kirby had bought out Games Workshop at the time, and he was interested in floating on the stock market, but to live up to the name Games Workshop and be more noticeable, he wanted to do 2 big box games a year. Aruga. We've been doing like one a year previously to this. So we had to crank up quite a lot to start doing that down that path. And not bad. We had many game ideas. There was many things we wanted to do, of course. One of which had actually been rattling around when I first joined Games Workshop back in 1990s, which was confrontation. And they'd done a load of background writing. This is, I say, before I joined. I can't speak as to exactly who did it. Jervis will be able to tell you better, actually, or Rick. But they'd done background, they'd done art, they'd even done some miniatures for it. They had a rule system for it, which was a Brian Ansell special, in that it was firmly rooted in those early 80s. Granular, complicated, maths heavy. Oh God, so maths heavy. The greatest revelation about that is Jervis had come up with like a little slide rule to calculating the factors on rolling to hit,
right.
and that sort of made it kind of playable. And we knew all this very intimately because we took it along as a demo participation game at Games days when they were still being run in Derby at the time, Derby assembly rooms. And we took it along and played it with some people, played it with each other. We're like, and I believe it was in White Dwarf as well.
Hmm.
Did they do the rules in White Dwarf or not? I think
They
they did.
did, yeah. They did a
Yeah,
couple of
yeah,
articles of it over a little
yeah.
while.
So, but unsurprisingly, yeah, it kind of sank. Never got any further from there. Now we need to do 2 big box games a year, though. Suddenly, that all that background already written and all that artwork already done sounds very appealing, doesn't it? Hence, Necromunda arose. Rick put together the overview and the background from what had gone before for Confrontation, and kind of left me and Jervis for the most part to handle the rules and the army lists for it, the gang lists for it, and the campaign specifically.
Hmm.
Because I say we were hot off doing Blood Bowl at the time, so we took most of what we'd learned there. I was hot off doing second edition 40k at the time as well. Plus, I was doing stuff in White Dwarf continuously through this. On average, every month I spent a week working on White Dwarf stuff in one form or another, and Jervis came up with a brilliant solution, and then saddled me with it of having chapter approved come back in White Dwarf. So we'd have like a monthly column of just answering questions and dicking around, as it was basically with the rules. So we introduced things like the new close combat system. Sorry about that, and so on. It seemed like a great idea at the time, and it kind of has its merits. Anyway, done all that. So second edition 40k rules were actually great for doing a kind of base level skirmish with just a few gang members fighting each other. We'd played around with it before now, hit on that idea that you kind of needed the pinning rule in there because just live or dead was too much when you've got fairly small gangs to start with. You know, you wipe each other out too fast otherwise, and light injuries and so forth. So we basically plugged a lot of what we'd learned from Blood Bowl across into a second edition 40k system,
Hmm.
and that was Necromunda for you. And likewise for the kind of gang lists, they were fairly tight in terms of like we just kept base stat lines. We didn't give Goliath extra strength much as we were tempted to, and all that sort of thing. Rick's like, no, don't do it. So we did it mainly through their sort of skill progression trees. Was how we differentiated between them. Again, they even had mostly they had access to the same weaponry as well. And so that was Necromunda, and we did a lot with the background and the campaign system for it. We ran much as for Blood Bowl, we'd run a league. That's why I talked about winning the cups, is because we did run a league that lasted for about a year,
Hmm.
and we did the Chaos Cup and all the rest of it as tournaments through that time. And we set up and ran a Necromunda league through the studio as well, because there was, fuck knows how many people there at the time, 60, 80 people, something like that, of which a lot of them were gamers, of course, and interested. The heavy metal guys was a particularly fine selection of guys who would paint their models as well. Because Necromunda only needed a few models, pretty much everybody was on board. Just paint up a few models compared to collecting an army. It was like nothing. So there was a lot of traction for the campaign, and it got really
Right.
entertaining. People, we did like newsletters for it, and people would like post up on the bulletin board with threats against other gangs and all this sort of stuff. It was lovely, really good fun times.
So would that be like 20, 30, 40, 50 people in the one campaign then? Or was it
Yeah,
like lots
it
of
wasn't.
different smaller ones?
No, it was one campaign, and
Right.
I can't remember. It wasn't as many as 50. It was maybe 20 people
Right. It's still
playing
a
in it.
lot of people in one.
Yeah, playing at lunchtimes and stuff like that,
Yeah.
or just after work. Because again, Necromunda was a fairly quick game to play as well compared to 40k. So a lot of traction through that, and obviously we learned a lot about what people wanted to do in the campaign. Some of the scenarios are like that we wrote in Necromunda were specifically because people were like, "We want to do this in the campaign." It's like, "All right, we'll write you a scenario for it," and just develop like that. And that's why I think it was because it was a resounding success again for
Mm,
Necromunda. It hit really well. Lovely miniatures, of course. Um, nice, interesting range of different gangs, and a
mm,
really solid sort of like little game to play in there as well. And the cardboard terrain and plastic bits, that was great to get some verticality in there, which was kind of essential for playing in that hive environment or just breaking up so it wasn't just a straight gunfight.
yeah.
Although we had those too. So yeah, we had a lot of fun with it, and that one I think kind of shows, and the fact it's come back round again now and is even more glorious. Actually, is really nice. It's good to see.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, do you think there's any relationship between what got the hype and the excitement in the studio versus what was successful out on the street? Were there any games that there was just a complete mismatch and everyone loved it in the studio, but nobody actually bought it, or vice versa? I guess.
Um, Hard to say. I say we didn't have a direct correlation between the two in that way. It's not like they publish sales numbers every. Not at
Yeah.
that time. They did later, actually. But at the time, no, not particularly. Generally, things that were popular in the studio seemed to hit better out in the world as well. I think just because they got better support
Hmm.
in general. There were more painted gangs to show off in White Dwarf. There were more different people to play the game when they wanted to do a battle report, and so on. And that always really helped. The ones where it maybe wasn't quite so popular, and they just had to do the basics of paint box contents and do the artwork that we need to do and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, they still did all right from what I could tell, but I think that was one of the things that helped separate out the big winners from
Hmm.
the more plodding ones. I mean, it came through in funny ways as well. Like even trying to do something like a battle report. When you're doing a battle report, you basically had to rely on what was in the cabinet
Hmm.
for your forces, which is why we often had some quite interesting, like, hey, look, it's one of each unit type armies to play with in battle reports. And of course, if people were really into things, there'd be other stuff done up as well, or you could borrow from somebody, or somebody could bring their own army to a battle report. But for those that didn't, you were down to the bare basics, and it was always a bit less of a satisfactory experience. So I think some subtle factors, some soft power
Yeah.
factors like that probably bled in to things, but whether that correlates with reality or not, I don't know. It's just anecdotal, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I like to think that the ones that had longevity, the ones that are still around now, did tend to be the ones that in that kind of little bottle environment did well,
Hmm.
that people liked and played a lot of. That's, as I say, I've got confirmation bias on that front, though, so don't listen to
Sure.
me too much. Wicked amounts of confirmation bias.
Well, one game that I wanted to ask you about that's not still around now, but it's still talked about quite a bit and sort of comes up every now
Mm.
and again is Gorka Morka. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah, and that
Oh
sounds
yeah.
sounds like there's an interesting sort of story behind the development of that. And there was some work going on with Warmaster, and then that got moved around in the schedules. Is that right? Is that how it sort of
Yeah,
first
yeah.
started?
Credit here, I can't remember the guy's name, damn, to the guy who did they did some investigative journalism on Gorka Morka and wrote a couple of articles on it not so long ago.
Sure. Yeah, I'll
Right.
put a link in the description. Yeah, because I've read
Okay.
it and it's
You know
great.
the one I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
part one and part two. Yes. Anyway, so you first have to go back a little bit. You asked me about things that were popular inside the studio and didn't really hit outside of it as well. There was one of those. Epic 40,000.
right.
Now, I'd done Space Marine Titan Legions, which is when we introduced Mega Gargants and Emperor Titans and shit like that. And Knights, once again. Hi. Hi, guys. Circling back around again. So I did Titan Legion Space Marine. And then after that, it was purported to be a good idea to do a new edition of Epic and to kind of take a different tack on it, a new system entirely. So me and Joe has cooked up a beautiful, elegant, marvelous system, Epic 40,000, which was way ahead of its time in many regards, and also, as we learned to our detriment, when you're doing a new edition of a game, don't change it too much.
Mm.
Because basically it split the player base straight away between like I hate it and I just like my Space Marine second edition Titan Legions, please go away, and the people who got into it sort of thing. So it didn't do very well. It caused a moderate splash at best, especially considering we put a lot of energy behind it, new miniatures and all the rest of it, lovely miniatures as well.
Mm.
So it didn't really do very well. And because of that, the next game that Rick had lined up is he'd done War Master, which was fantasy epic scale. And it killed that stone dead as far as the board were concerned. And they said, no, you're not doing that. Give us Gorka Morka instead. I'm not quite sure who instigated the Gorka Morka part of it, but something 28 mil for 40k or
Mm.
something of that. I don't know exactly what the brief was, but it turned into Gorka Morka, that's for sure. Now, I say we were doing 2 games a year, busy at the time, plus White Dwarf. First, we got to hear of it in the trenches. Was about April. Yeah, anyway, you can read all this in the article. I don't need to go into bloody details of it. What it boiled down to is like usually, I mean, I talked about Blood Bowl and Necromunda and the fact that in effect we were working on them for about a year, to a certain extent intermingled with that. We were running a campaign as well. So we had about 18 months to 2 years working on games prior to this. Gorka Morka, when it hit my desk, I had to turn it around in 8 weeks to hit publishing deadlines because we had to send things out to the printers by blah date. Otherwise, it would miss blah, and that means you wouldn't get it for Christmas and all this sort of stuff. So it was an absolute. It was being chased through corridors by somebody with a fire axe, kind of an experience for me. I had to just like bolt myself off into a cubicle and work for 8 weeks on that, nothing else. And I did it by taking Necromunda, in effect,
Mm.
orcifying all of it, thanks to all that previous work on Warg the Orcs and stuff like that. Plenty of terms and names and art to go with that. Slapping that together with the basic rules that Rick had come up with for vehicles and developing a campaign system around that as well, and a bit of testing. To be fair as well, there was good enthusiasm from the guys in the studio as well. They built little vehicles and tested with it and stuff like that. They liked it, but it didn't hit quite as well as Necromunda. Not everybody was into orcs, is what it came down to. Which is kind of how it hit in the world as well. It's like the people who love it, and they are still playing it to this day. I'm on a Gorka Morka group on Facebook. They're still going at it, man, crumping each other. They love it. Um, so yeah, for those who it hits with well, but I can't imagine it did that well for Workshop because while we had the usual train of support was to do a supplement fairly soon after, like within three or 4 months after the main game releases, to catch that wave, keep it going a little bit further, plus a bunch of box sets as well, which would keep going
Mm.
theoretically in perpetuity, depending on the game system. But everything for Gorka Morka, all that was done, and it kind of hit the shelves, and then we just stopped after about 6 months doing any more support for it. Which I don't know to what extent that was because it didn't hit as well as it could, or just that by that point Tom Kirby was less interested in the 2 games a year kind of an approach, having already floated, I think, by that point on the stock market or whatever. But yeah,
Well, I think they
Gorka
talk
Morka,
about I think it's Goonhammer is the
that's
website,
the one,
yeah.
isn't it? Yes.
And they talk
Got
about
it.
because it was the international push as well. So lots of
Oh,
different
yeah,
foreign
yeah,
language
yeah, yeah, yeah.
editions and
Gorka Morka in Spanish and things like
yeah, yeah,
that as well.
maybe just too many in the warehouse to shift, and then
Yeah.
that obviously becomes a drain or a negative on the balance sheet.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and you're paying for storing them as well.
Yeah.
Not only have you paid for these goods that you can't sell, you're paying to store them now.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can take a bath very quickly, and I suspect the whole thing because there was it's a very good point. Thank you, Goonhammer, once again for doing your proper investigative journalism. There was at the time, a French business, Spanish business, an Italian business, a Northern Europe business, and an American business too, as well as an Australian one. And certainly the European ones, there were language translations for most of what we were doing. We used to have all the fun and games. The fact that German's 25%, sorry, Germany as well. Sorry, Germany, didn't mean to forget about you. That German's like 25% longer when you translate it. So cards and things like that, you're like, oh, text falling off the end. All those fun times. And yeah, but it represents a risk at the end of the day.
Mm.
If you print a bunch of copies in French or Spanish or German, you can't sell them. What are you going to do with them then? It's not like you can, sell them on the UK or American markets, is it? So yeah, I imagine that was all a bit of a debacle, frankly.
So,
Certainly, not long after that, the new diktat was 3 systems. We do 40k, we do Warhammer, not for long, and we do Lord of the Rings, and we don't dally around with anything else.
hmm,
Came down, yeah. By the time the waves from the Gorka Morka had receded.
sure.
Um,
You would connect those sort of like strategies. The Gorka Morka would have had that much of an impact over time. Do you think?
yeah, yeah. I mean, there were a few kind of final pulses that we managed, mainly because Rick fought for them, so I got
Hmm,
to do Battlefleet Gothic finally.
yeah,
Rick got Gav got to do Inquisitor, but yeah, we were living on borrowed time, I think, at that point.
right. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a shame, isn't it? As well, for me at
Mm.
least, because I always loved the sort of secondary, the boxed games that came out.
To me, it was essential. It was part of what made the 40k universe, in particular, the Games Workshop universes, if you will, what they were, was the fact not that they existed just as a box game and a
Mm,
set of supplemental product for that, but as a universe with different game systems and different stuff going on in them, over and above what happened on the tabletop. And I think part because I came from Epic in many regards, so I'd even before I worked on 40k, I'd kind of like started seeing it as that bigger picture of like armies, and, campaigns and stuff like that, not just you know 10 Space Marines show up at Outpost 27 to see what happened, which was kind of more where Rogue Trader was coming from
mm,
originally. So, but I was very informed by looking at it from through an epic scale lens to make it more about big campaigns. And yeah, it might be a small number of people fighting here because they're fighting for whatever their headquarters or trying to assassinate the enemy leader or something like that. That conceptualization of it being a bigger, wider universe with more going on in it was really key for me, and that meant doing games like Gorka Morka, Necromunda, expanded it in a way that just sticking with the mainstream system and doing another chapter of Space Marines never, ever, ever could
mm,
or would want to, And I felt that was one of the things that has given 40k that broad base that it still rests so securely upon now. And for Warhammer, it had been the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. That was the thing that sort of like broadened and deepened it so much that the war game was cool in itself, but the fact it rested on this wider universe that there were maps of Altdorf and all that sort of stuff. You wouldn't do those for a war game, but the fact they existed actually added to the universe in a way and built it from away from being just a war game and into a bigger universe. So, for me, at least, the minute the Games Workshop stopped doing that, it meant that they were freezing themselves in place
mm.
and just emphasizing those. Now, more recently, we've seen them try to make efforts to break away from that. I mean, they killed Warhammer altogether and replaced it with Age of Sigmar. And they've done the whole Indomitus Crusade stuff for 40k to sort of like shake up the universe and push the timeline forward in a conscious fashion,
Mm.
which is a way of doing it. I think flushing the entire Warhammer world was an appalling act of desecration in many
Mm.
regards, waste to a large extent. Absolutely pointless, really. If they could have done the entire Age of Sigmar in the Realm of Chaos and just kept both of them. But anyway, that's just me. The Indomitus Crusade I've actually got a lot more empathy for of having worked within the 40k universe and wanting to push it forward, trying to push it forward through the Eye of Terror campaign and stuff like that. It's good that they finally got to do so, frankly. Go them.
Yeah, because the Eye of Terror stuff was a really interesting, exciting time, right? But that was
Mm.
an experiment. I think it's fair to say in terms of getting those fan submissions online and all that sort of stuff, right? And there's
Yeah,
maybe
well, we had run several previous campaigns, and they were always very, very popular,
Hmm,
which is why we kept running them. So we did the ICAR 4 campaign, and then we did Armageddon campaign, and then we did the Eye of Terror campaign. And there were equivalent Warhammer ones as well at
hmm,
different times. But yeah, the Eye of Terror one was the one where it got really off the hook because the internet was far more of a thing by that point. I mean, literally, Eye of Terror. I think was the first one that we assessed on that alone. Because ICAR 4, it was snail mail letters that was done on. Because there wasn't any other way of doing it at the time. So, but yeah, and things moved that fast and changed a lot. So it was almost a semi-automated online campaign. So it got abused quite apart from anything else. But there you go. It got people playing games. That was the main point. So
Did you
that's a
have?
win.
Did you write sort of both potential outcomes? Did you, or multiple potential outcomes, or was it really like, let's see what the numbers come back as, and then we'll deal with what?
Yeah, we didn't pre-decide.
Right,
Yeah, we just waited for the numbers to come back and decided on that basically.
right,
Um, yeah, there wasn't multiple endings in envelopes or anything like that. And I mean, I know some game systems have done that, but no, we were far more interested in basically getting an interesting story out of what the
mm,
players were, rather than trying to tell our own crowbarred onto particular set, what we assess different results to mean.
yeah,
But that did make it unsatisfactory, I think, in
yeah.
the
I
end,
mean, with
the
because
outcomes of the
there's
campaigns.
shades of what took place in the Eye of Terror campaign were
Yeah.
then actually used as almost the seeds of the later stuff, right? So
Well,
it
yeah,
revisited later. Same with Storm of Chaos as well for
yeah,
Warhammer in the
yeah,
end
yeah.
time.
Oh, you work in that environment. You don't let anything that's gone previously to go to waste, particularly if
Right,
you liked it. And the chances are, if you're working in that environment, you liked it. So yeah, more power to them. That what's going on now in the Indominus Crusade is kind of what we had in mind for After Eye of Terror, but yeah, we were told we weren't allowed to move in 42nd millennium.
right.
But then people won't be able to say it's the 41st millennium anymore, and we'll have to change logos and stuff.
Sure. Right. I
Not
mean,
long after that, I departed Games Workshop
right.
and started on an exciting new world in freelancing and doing lots of other things.
Hmm. I mean, I always heard there was a rumor that there might be like a ultramarine civil war or something of that nature. Was that ever on the cards? Was that something you were thinking about?
Not me personally, but like I say, I didn't generally pay too much attention to Space Marines if I could avoid it. You should ask somebody who worked with the Space Marines more if they had that in mind.
Right. Okay. And
Civil war between Space Marines was always we didn't do enough of it, if I'm honest. Probably because I didn't like Space Marines that much, so I was always more interested in getting more alien races in.
hmm,
But frankly, fights between Space Marines could have been more of a thing. But you got Horus Heresy taking care of that these days.
yeah, yeah, very much so, and on a huge scale now, right?
Yeah,
That sort of
yeah,
thing.
absolutely.
Before you left, you did do the third edition of 40K as well. What was the sort of?
Third and fourth, actually.
Sure, of course, yeah, and
Yeah,
they.
sorry, I'm jumping ahead a bit, aren't I?
No, not at all. That's okay. And I don't want to keep you all day, so I appreciate there's only so much time. But I'm just conscious of that shift from second to third edition, which was
Hmm.
consolidated in fourth, was quite a significant one as well. So,
Yes.
what was the sort of thinking in that move?
Um, Much like going from Rogue Traders to second edition, simplification of the game, making it more direct, more logical, all in one place. In this particular case, the feeling came back, well, dictate from on high is like, we want people to use armies twice the size as they were using in 40k. Now, 40k armies, they're around 25 to 50 models, depending on who they were and what they chose. So the idea was go to 50 to 100 a brute level, and that's putting it in the most base terms. But yeah, that's
Hmm,
really what the aim point was, and that was kind of fair enough, if I'm honest, because second edition is a great fun game as a skirmish. The more you take, the more it starts to break, especially with some of the wacky shit that I put in there, quite among other people. So it kind of started to break down for larger games, and it was slow to play it for larger games as well. And all this time, people have been collecting larger and larger armies, bigger and bigger forces that they wanted to play with. So they're caught in this situation of like, well, we can have these giant grinding games that take all day. Cool, if you can find time and energy and space for that. And people did that. But again, accessibility was an issue. Not everyone could do that, but they'd like to be able to play with their large 40k army. Thank you very much, if we can, particularly in stores and stuff like that. So the idea was to take what 40k was doing and render it more as a battle game, less as a skirmish game, which is kind of where its roots had come from. And so, scissors time to trim out some of the fat and some of that detail and realism and so forth, and actually work on the abstractions being the ones that you want, that I talked about earlier, basically. I was kind of a bit horrified at first because I've been working on second edition for all this time, so I was very comfortable with it. And when Rick sort of first pitched it and sort of showed us the rules he'd been working on, like the vehicle rules, particularly horrified me. It's like, ugh, we're just rolling a d6 for the result now. Where's my hit locations, etc. But playing it for a little while, it was very apparent. Like, yeah, you know what? I can easily get a game done in half the time. And actually, it's still 40k, very much still 40k. What it doesn't have is like armor save modifiers and to hit modifiers that you have to look up quite often and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, all right, yeah, because again, we come through a large history of understanding that narrowing it down is often a good option as long as you don't go too far. So yeah, worked through third, did that basically. From my perspective, the most exciting thing about it was being able to kind of like zero out all of the armies again in balance in relationship to each other and make some fundamental changes that hadn't been possible. So things like the orc stat line changing, so they were actually good in close combat, which was the way they always read, like they were, and they were always up for it. But actually, they were Imperial Guardsmen in close combat with toughness 4, and so on. So a lot of stuff like that, kind of continuation of stuff that I talked about as we started doing in second. We could consolidate a lot of that with the Eldar as well, and changing their weapon systems. And like, oh god, we don't get 24-inch ranges. Like, no, you don't. No, you don't. Your shuriken catapults are actually different to bolters now, not just bolters with more shots, etc. So yeah. It was good. It was good. It was a good spring clean. You get this with any game system. Is like once you've developed it for a few years, particularly with a monthly magazine, sticking extra bits onto it,
Mm.
an inverted pyramid, it just gets more and more unstable. You can keep putting weights on different sides of the pyramid to keep it upright, but it's more and more unstable. So it doesn't take much to push it over at that point. Whereas if start fresh, you can get a solid foundation and start over again before you break the entire game through all your codexes and special rules. Because that will happen over time, guaranteed. And it's nothing to do with sales, it's just the way it works.
Yeah, because there's always the sort of the scuttlebutt on the ground is that a
Yeah.
new codex is designed to be more powerful, to sell more units. Was it ever
I
like that, or was it just the way it goes naturally?
What we found was there was a little bit of that. What the bigger thing though is no one wants something that's worse than what went before. Yeah.
Mm,
So if I give you a new Imperial Guard Codex, is it the same as you had before? Well, that's just boring, isn't it? Is it worse than what you had before? That's terrible. Have you got some new things that you didn't have before that are better? Yes. Now you like it.
mm.
And it's as simple an equation as that, really. You can't really go backwards. You can't really stay where you are either. You have to go forwards. And I saw this happen time and time again, not just in 40k, never done consciously. It was always guys just working on their codex or their army list or their thing that didn't want it to be bad. Why would you write something to be bad? And that's basically what you get, that sort of subtle pressure. And yeah, it is a bit better. And you know what? Once they've finished all their stuff, and you just take that unit, that unit, that unit, they're awesome compared to what the opponent, etc. It is, and it is a problem, and it's a little bit unavoidable, I'm afraid, in a developing game system because of that. You can't go backwards factor. Nobody's going to thank you for it ever.
True. And that's why I think a lot of people still look back on, like, the indexes or the Ravening Hordes book for
Yeah, if you
Warhammer
want
as
balance, there is the point you have to look at it.
yeah.
Is yeah, you look at the Black Codex for second edition for 40k and the equivalent for third is the closest you'll find to a balanced set of lists because they were done holistically at the same time. It's interesting actually in 10th they've been trying to do that this time, but the range is just so enormous, it's almost impossible to do. But that's the one opportunity you have, that brief window to sort of like get everyone on a baseline again for a while before you start putting in special rules for things, breaking everything and making everything better. Because you don't want things to be bad, do you? Do you? Really? And the other factor, actually, which is subtler still, is you just get better with the game system over time of like writing more supplemental material for it. You start to understand what will actually be advantageous more than not even necessarily at a conscious level. So when you give somebody a good thing, is all I'm saying, is after you've written 5 codexes, that good thing is liable to be better than the thing you wrote in Codex 1.
Mm.
Or, even more exciting, it'll be more balanced, but not as good as the thing in Codex 1 in comparison to it, because you've gone, oh shit, we shouldn't do that again, but it's still there in Codex 1.
Mm.
So yeah, it's very fraught. It's very fraught, and I do applaud the fact that finally, only about 20 years too late, Games Workshop are taking advantage of the internet to try and keep a lid on this sort of stuff and treat it as a living system,
Mm.
which is again something Jervis was doing decades ago with Blood Bowl, but upper management at Workshop. There's a reason we talk about people being stuck on golden thrones and unable to speak and make decisions and things like
So then maybe the satire faces inwards a little bit more than outwards sometimes.
that. Yeah, more than you know, believe
Okay.
me.
Well, maybe that might be a subject for next time. I mean, I did have one last question, just about your more recent work
Mm,
with Warlord,
right.
Warlord Games, where you've been working on the 2000 AD licenses. You've done a Judge Dredd game, Strontium Dog, Slain. They sort of use variations of that same system. How has
Mm,
it been different working in that kind of space? So an entirely new IP, a new
mm.
opportunity. How does that differ to the work you were doing at GW over the years?
Well, to a certain extent, you're doing the same things. In a mechanical sense, you're trying to create what I talked about earlier on, an environment where whatever abstractions you're using are actually helping your players to focus on the kind of like the mental mind map imagery of what's going on the tabletop and give it life and give it excitement. Doing that for a comic book universe, yeah, that was quite different. I mean, 40K is quite comic-y in some ways, comic book in some ways, but not necessarily the game, the tabletop game, because it has to deal with a lot of different things. Going from that and dealing with larger armies and stuff like that to working on a very much a skirmish game where I mean the box content, the Strontium Dogs, the great start point for this, the box contents for that, the verses is Johnny Alpha, Wolf Sternhammer, plus the Gronk, so 3 miniatures, one of which is non-combatant and doesn't have a gun, versus a bad guy villain, Max Bubba, and the Bubba Gang, which is 4 other dudes. So 3 versus, well, sort of 2 really, and portable war gear is the way I always thought of the Gronk, versus 5. That's all of your miniatures for the game, and it needs to be able to play at that level as well. And it's got to be able to sort of like give you that comic book feel about it. And so it does require some very specific mechanisms to try and make that work, to make the heroes heroic enough, but still be vulnerable to being taken down by cheapskate little bad guys and things like that, but also to rip through them in a single round and so on. So it's an interesting balancing point on that one. I've learned a lot over the time since I was at Games Workshop because I've been doing freelance games design pretty much continuously. Well, that or narrative and world design, to be fair. But certainly since about 2011, I've been working on game systems again, and that's what I did immediately after Games Workshop as well. I did Starship Troopers at that point. So one of the first things I did when I started working at Games Workshop was work on systems where you didn't have to use exactly the same mechanics, because I'd spent 14 years working with the same mechanics. So I got very excited by different mechanics. If you find a copy of Starship Troopers, it's worth picking up just for that. I would like just watch Andy go mad not having to work on 40K for the first time in a decade. And so to bring it around to what you were actually asking about, Slain and Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd, and now ABC Warriors as well. That's on the skids coming out soon. represent the kind of the end of that journey to a large extent, where I've played around with a lot of game systems. I've done a lot of different skirmish games at this stage, and it kind of summarized a lot of my thinking and what I've learned along the way in terms of game system. And it's not bad. It's not the best game system in the world, but it's certainly not the worst. And it's entertaining and it's quite comic-like. One of the real challenges that we faced is that if you've read like Judge Dredd or anything like that, you'll know that very occasionally that they'll pull something out. Heat seeker rounds is the classic for Judge Dredd, where they can shoot somebody around a corner, or dodgems, ricochet bullets, again, shoot people around corners, high explosive or something like that. But they only ever do it when it's dramatically appropriate to do so. Yeah, you don't car with high explosives. It's just not done. So it was kind of like how you put those into the player's hands and yet limit their usage at the same time. And you don't just literally buy them off an army list or something like that. So we went back in many ways to second edition, 40k, the idea of cards. Cards do good things on that front. Cards are marvelous. Cards introduce like a whole little extra slice of rules that you only need circumstantially. So that was the big answer for that, and it was also a way of injecting some of the larger universe background to the games as well, of like not just having the literal like physical armory cards as we call them, but for example, Judge Dredd has big meg cards, which are basically just event cards
Mm.
for things that happen in the big meg, which are the sort of things that you run across in the comic strips, like boingers or simp parades and stuff like that. And they just add some color again and just help sort of sell that idea of like, yeah, you're playing a game, but this is just Dredd. Check it out, fatties and all that sort of stuff. They're a troop type for people who don't know Judge Dredd.
That's great, and because they're also you can compatible is the word I was looking for there.
They're
They're
cross-compatible.
compatible, right?
Well, Slane's a bit of an offshoot in
Sure.
some ways, because that's dealing specifically with fantasy barbarians with axes chopping each other up, as opposed to when we designed Strontium Dog, it was mainly to be used as sort of almost like a Western gunfight style skirmish game, because that's very much what Strontium Dog is kind of based off. It's based off the old spaghetti westerns. So that the idea of a protagonist and an antagonist, and then peons that you blow away to make you look good and things like that. What we found is the original idea was to do a system for doing the 2000 AD games, because Warlord had the license and they wanted to do a bunch of them. The deal is that they can't just do Judge Dredd, because that's the famous one. Everybody wants to do Judge Dredd, but they can do Judge Dredd and other things.
Mm.
So we did Strontium Dog first to test the system out, and then rolled into doing Judge Dredd and used the same system for both. So they are cross-compatible, which is appropriate because in the 2000 AD universe, they are crossover. Johnny Alpha has appeared in Mega City 1, and Judge Dredd's been dragged off by Johnny Alpha at one point and stuff like that. They are literally cross-compatible, which is a bit of a commonality in 2000 AD games. So it was kind of there in the thinking in the first place. Slane, as I say, we had to diverge a little bit to make fantasy and magic and things like that work in the system. But what I actually ended up doing was I'd made more changes, and the feedback I kept reading for Strontium Dog and Judge Dredd was how happy people were that it was a cross-compatible game, and they didn't have to learn a new game system. And I was like, right, okay, well, maybe we will not change the names on different characteristics and stuff like that, and actually go back to using a more similar system to the one that's used in them. So at least, yeah, there's a transition, but it's only in a few areas and it's a bit more limited in general, rather than I've been more free with it. And then for ABC Warriors, yeah, we've gone back to using exactly the same system. Because I've got empathy. I'm old now too, and I don't particularly like learning new rules either. So I think having more games that use the same rule system, if it's a solid enough rule system, sure, why not? It's
Mm.
going back from under again. I suspect one of the reasons it was so popular was like it was just 40k with less miniatures at the end of the day and a few extra little wibbly rules to make it a bit more skirmishy. So very easy to pick up because you already knew the game. You didn't have to learn a new one. So yeah, I've got a lot more empathy for that these days than I have did when I was younger. So they've done very well, and it's great. I did literally grow up reading 2000 AD comics. I still subscribe to it to this day, and I recommend anybody to do so. It's got great stuff in it. It's got Dan Abnett strips in it right now, and Gordon Rennie. So well worth it supporting your 2000 AD. So being able to like go back to like the Wellspring really, because that was around before Games Workshop, 40k, all of that for me, and so much of my work and Rick's work and Jez's work and everybody else's work at the studio was influenced by 2000 AD all the time, because it's a weekly comic, man, made in the UK, so it's kind of uniquely British too. And so yeah, going back to the Wellspring like that has just been an absolute joy. It is so much fun. Get
I'll bet.
an excuse to reread your 2000 ADs. You can get to pull out different bits of equipment and things that get shouted, basically.
I mean, there's so many great names in
etc.
Judge Dredd. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, it's funny actually when you come to make a game out of it. There's kind of less than you think.
okay.
In comparison to having to do like an entire like army list, etc. stuff, it tends to be quite sparse.
Right.
Weirdly, what you do is you focus in, you hive in, and you remember really clearly the specific examples you were given. Right? It's like going through all of the Strontium Dog stories trying to find names of guns in there. There's about 5.
Right.
But I bet you can remember every single one of them because they were really key when it was said at the time, and it's a key scene in a particular Johnny Alpha strip where it's called The Killing, where they're all coming up to do what is essentially a battle royale, and they're registering their weapons, and they stay, Westinghouse blaster and all this sort of stuff. And oh yeah, napalm blister blaster, yeah, etc. But there's less of those than you think there are. It's
Right.
weird. Your mind kind of fills in a lot of this sort of stuff, and your assumption that there was this very kind of like textured universe behind it all, but there's not quite often. We end up having to like make up little bits here and there. Obviously, we don't if we can avoid it. But
Yeah.
best example of that was doing ABC Warriors. Because another thing you get is like, particularly things like Judge Dredd, they go through eras, different artists, different writers, different stuff happening. And first with Slain, that goes through some very distinct visual eras of different artists. They treat it in very different ways. So to a certain extent, for the miniatures, you have to pick one and go with it and say this one to make it cohesive. This wasn't a problem for Strontium Dog because it was all Esquire, nearly all Esquire, and anything noteworthy was Esquire in a very distinct art style. Not so with Judge Dredd, not so with Slain, not so with ABC Warriors. So in each case, we had to like pick an era of comic book to follow. And for ABC Warriors, we've chosen the Vulcan Wars, which is one of the most recent ones. Bisley art, beautiful Bisley art, amazing. Just the most gorgeous ABC. Anyway, picked that because they look good, and it also had some distinct factions to put against. It's got bad guy robots, the equivalent of ABC Warriors, perfect thing, And at one point, they're the sort of bad guy warriors, which are all these ex-Volgan models. And it names all of them at different points, a bunch of them. But you don't know which names are associated with which robots. I mean, there's some of them named directly, and then they're addressing each other and stuff. But there's one point where Volcan like addresses his Volgan champions, as it were. And there's just like a load of different names over the top of it. You can go, okay, that's that one. That's that one. But there were about 5 of them that we didn't know which name went with which robot. So bless him, Gav Thorpe got in touch with Pat Mills to ask him, said, which one of these are which? We're doing the game for this at the moment. He's like, honestly, I don't remember. I'm not sure I even knew at the time. Was the very frank answer we got back. Like, huh, okay then. Yeah, fair enough, fair dues.
That was great. I know that's terrific, and yeah, before we go, is there anything else that you're working on, Andy, that you wanted to mention or just sort of shout out?
I constantly work freelance still to this day, mostly in tabletop. I do some digital things as well. Things that I've got going on at the moment. You mentioned the Warlord Games already for 2000 AD. They're very close to my heart. Warlord also produced Blood Red Skies, which is a World War II mass aerial combat game, which is probably the best designed game I've ever done. Very, very clean. I'd recommend it to anybody who's got any time for any kind of game I've written in the past because it's very good. Easy to get into as well because you only need a handful of planes. The other thing I'm working on, have been working on for the last couple of years, is a anime-inspired mecha combat, except they're not mecha. Apparently, mecha are like 40-foot tall plus. Kinetic action robot-y game called Xeogenesis, which I'm working on once again with my very good friend and colleague Gav Thorpe, and a number of other talented artists and miniature designers. And we're trying to make anime-style mecha. Except they're not mecha. I keep getting told they're not mecha because they're not 40 feet tall. Giant armored fighting suits. We call them Zero forms for a reason because they don't quite fit into any category. But it's very inspired by kind of Appleseed, Gundam to a certain extent, that kind of thing, which is not entirely in my wheelhouse, which is one of the reasons I got Gav into it because it is in his. But I'm doing the rule systems for that, and it's good. It's again, it's quite skirmish level in that you don't have an awful lot of miniatures, but it's based around these Zeo forms, which are quite big. They're kind of like in 40k terms, they're dreadnought size or bigger.
Right.
But they're not slow. They're not clomp, clomp, clomp style things. These are guys who sparks fly off their feet as they skid round corners, kind of a thing. So that's where the kinetic side of it comes in.
Right.
And that's been a lot of fun. It's been a bit scary for me because it's involved working with D10s, which made me realise nearly every game I've ever done has been with D6s, or at least six-sided dice at this point. But so that's been a bit of a voyage of discovery in its own right. But yeah, the plan for that is we're doing actual injection molded plastic for the Zeo forms as kits. There are kind of like infantry support models that come along with them, but they are kind of like their support for the big Zeo forms is the idea. It's a very anime idea that they have their team where there's the pilot in the Zeo form, and then there'll be the sniper, the demolition guy, as backup for them to exercise the plan while they're fighting away.
Yeah.
Got to have that interpersonal dialogue after all. So it's quite distinctive. It's a lot of fun. So we've been taking that into few different shows over the course of this year because we've got a few miniatures to show off and things like that at this point. Blaster magazine has got a spin-off game that I wrote for it, a spaceship game called
Yeah.
Slip Runners, which should be coming a bit later in this year.
That's
And we're
great.
planning to do some Kickstarter type stuff around it, even though I swore up and down it wasn't going to be a Kickstarter. Apparently now it is.
Because you releasing that yourselves, you and Gav are sort of producing the.
We are being employed by a sugar daddy for this purpose. The man who put together Pest Hobby, nice man who made a small fortune working in the software industry. But he originally worked in tabletop back in the day, and he always dreamed of doing a tabletop miniatures game with anime style robot fighting suits. So now he's come full circle. He's retired on his Dragon's Horde, and he says he's determined to try and lose it as slowly as possible, making a miniature game, because we warned him many times he's going to lose a lot of money trying to do this. But he's 100% serious. God bless him. He's bought himself machinery and all sorts of things, and hired our services. So we're invested. We are invested on that one.
That's ace.
Yeah, it's been fun doing something just like completely new as
Hmm.
well. I've done a lot of different franchise and IP work over the years. I'm good for it. I'm good at it at this point. But to do something completely fresh it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
That's great. Well, I'll look out for that. That sounds really cool.
I'm trying to think now what I'm overlooking or forgetting, and it's almost certainly something. But yes, yeah, they're the primary ones. And I say Blood Red Skies, I'm particularly proud of. That's out now. Get that. I actually get royalties on that, so please buy it.
So that's the one. That's the one. That
that's the real one. All the other ones have been paid for already, so I don't care. But actually, I do care with the Best Hobby one because I'll get a royalty on that too. I hope to retire one day, eventually. Give the young'uns a chance to write games without me lurking around all the time.
Well, hopefully
Which
you've got a
actually has
few
been
more
very
games.
good. Yeah, I hope so too. And the fact is, even when I do retire, I don't think I'll actually be able to stop. But it's been funny because Jervis has retired recently, as you may know. He's officially retired. He made it. He did his full tour, made it all the way through to retirement age at Games Workshop, which is a startling achievement. Oh, kitty.
Yes,
Uh,
there's Martha.
oh, hi, Martha. clearly getting a bit bored. It's like, what are you doing? Isn't it time to feed me? Anyway, so he's now in the situation where he's like, ah, actually retired and not having to design games all the time and stuff like that. Guess what he's doing? Can you guess?
I'm imagining he might be designing a game, perhaps.
Perhaps. Might be. May actually be doing some consultation work with me as well, which has been really nice. Actually, it's the first time in more than 20 years I've had a chance to work with journalists. Oh, brings
Oh,
a tear to my eye. It does.
that's great. Is that something that will be announced and talked about when the time is right, I guess?
Yeah, I don't think I can talk about it just yet. But that's a franchise IP game,
Hmm.
which will it'll come out in due course. And we're literally just consultants on it. The guys have written their own set of rules. They just want some old farts to give them some guidance on it, which is fine by me. I think it's great when people write their own rule sets and just pay me to say, no, this is rubbish, do it again, rather than me having to do it from the ground up. No problem with that at all.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for taking the time out to chat with me. It's been really fascinating, some very interesting stuff. So I
I'm
really
sorry I've
appreciate
kept you
it.
so long. I do tend to
Not at
go.
all. No, I'd keep going, but I had so much fun chatting with Andy. Not only a brilliant game designer, but also a gifted raconteur and storyteller, and wonderfully funny. It was a real treat. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and being so generous with your reflections and recollections. If you enjoyed this interview, you can see more like it here on the channel. I recently released my conversation with Alessio Cavatore, and on my Patreon, I have some exclusive interviews as well, and longer versions of certain interviews too. Go and check it out. I've put a link in the description below if you're interested. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.